welcome to ICT on PNC. This is our periodic podcast where we delve into what's going on in the PNC industry here in Texas and any of the legislation or regulation that might be impacting our industry. On this particular episode, we are going to do a little recap of what we're doing for hurricane season. It is June already. And as we say, it's June, so it's almost Christmas. Hurricane season is underway and starting, so we got a couple months ahead for that. And so ICT is putting out information, putting together a campaign on that and how to educate the public on preparing for that here in Texas. And then we're going to do a recap of the 88th legislative session, which ended officially on the 29th, but then we are in a special session was called. So we'll talk about some of the bills that died, bills that passed, maybe where we are with TWIA, and some other issues that may have bubbled up. So to kick things off, as always, we have Angie Cervantes and Albert Betts with ICT, and I am Rich Johnson, also with ICT, and we're going to go ahead and kick things off with hurricane season. We are, we're about a couple days into it now. It's predicted to be a kind of a regular or quote unquote normal hurricane season. Nothing too harsh, but definitely nothing that we want to ignore either. Albert, I mean, if you want to talk a little bit just kind of about the coast and some of the things that are going on down there, you know, our industry, the private market, I think we're around 60 or 65% that we actually cover down there. You know, a lot of people believe that maybe the insurance industry doesn't cover the coast, but that's just not true, right?
Very much not true. Thank you, Rich. The industry writes probably closer now to about 55% of the wind and hail along the coast, not counting, obviously, auto and other coverages, which are not part of TWIA's coverages. So, yeah, hurricane season is always interesting here because we're always watching to make sure that we're ready and prepared. Although hurricanes may hit along the coast, as we observed with Harvey, they travel up through Texas. It may cause much more extensive damage in the private market areas. So something to keep an eye on. I've already noticed there's a little formation. It's supposedly not gonna form into anything, but a small formation over near Florida, I think as we speak. And so they're keeping an eye on that. It looks like just a heavy rain event. But I think for us, we've been lucky since 2017. No hurricanes have landed on the Texas coast. Unfortunately, those have gone into Louisiana multiple times, and so some problems there in that market. But I think we're ready. Our message, Rich, I believe, is be prepared. We'll be ready to respond pre-hurricane, during the storm, and then post-hurricane to recover. So hopefully a calm season. And TWIA, as you mentioned, about 45% or so of the wind coverage on the coast, but they are, I think, in the process, Angie, correct me if I'm wrong, of finalizing their funding, or at least their reinsurance funding for this hurricane season. And their funding, as their board agreed to, will be about $4.5 billion for this catastrophe year. So they're ready, as far as I can tell. They're covered, and barring multiple storms or some very, very large storm, TWIA funding for at least this year hopefully will be sufficient.
Yeah, and so as we go into this hurricane season, we do have a campaign going. This is one of our bigger campaigns that we do, kind of public safety, public information campaign. We'll have paid social, we'll have public relations, but really getting the message out there about what the insurance company does during hurricane season, actually before, during, and after, and making sure that people have the right coverages. Do they need to look into TWIA? Do they have, the proper wind coverage? And most important, should they look into flood insurance? So that's kind of the messaging that we're getting out there, as well as those safety tips, preparing your home, hardening your home, putting together an evacuation plan, putting together an emergency kit. So, we just have a lot of information out out there that we're putting out over the next 4 or 5 months as we head into hurricane season. And for more information on any of that, if anybody's interested, insurancecouncil.org/hurricane central. That's where we have advice, tips, graphics that people can download, and resources that you can use. So here we are, deep into hurricane season. Well, not deep, but just kicking off hurricane season 2023. With that, I'm going to kick it over to you guys and talk about some of the bills that died, bills that passed, where we're at with this legislative session. And a couple of interesting things not having to do with bills and legislation that happened with Texas's Attorney General. I'm sure you guys will talk about that a little bit as we get into this. So Angie, Albert, it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Angie, we can start off with what do you think of the finale? And I'm not talking about Succession, but actually the session here in Texas, or we could talk Succession if you'd like, but interesting last week or two to wrap up the ABA session.
It was, I think, it was interesting, and I don't think many people had that on their bingo card, what happened, if per se, even people that were following session. So should we start with that? I guess we should start with the big finale, the big bang.
Yeah, let's start with that. Although it's not insurance, it did eat up the last 5-6 last week or so almost of the session.
It did, and I think that when you talk about things that we were watching, I mean, I think we knew there were slim chances of the TWIA funding bill making it up the calendar, but when you look at the chunk of time that took up on the last 2 days, it really did affect the rest of the bills and everything that was going on. So yeah, it did. I know we were exchanging messages mid last week, the final week of the session, as you watch time deadlines hit, midnight approach, going through the calendar, guesstimating which bills would be heard on the House floor before midnight. And then slowly watching time disappear, and bills died for lack of time. There's always the possibility of amendment, but even as we got to the last couple of days, other deadlines hit, and we realized some of the things that we talked about on previous podcasts we're simply not going to have enough time to make it through session. And beyond the Attorney General impeachment proceedings, the last weekend of session, and we still had ongoing discussions over property tax, the budget for the state, which I believe, I don't remember the exact date, seemed to finally be agreed upon the last 2 or 3 days of session. Yep.
And so just a lot of going on. I guess the good thing I can say, I think is a good thing, is PNC was not at the forefront of anyone's major issues during session, which is good. Because typically, if we're at the forefront, that means something's not going well.
right. It's
Here
better
in
to
the Texas market.
not be noticed.
That is also true. So beyond the impeachment proceeding, and that will go on through this summer at least. I think there's an August 28th deadline for or a time frame set for Senate hearing on it, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, and I think that they're going to set the rules. The Senate will set the rules by June 20th. So we'll know what their rules for their trial will be, and then they'll have to actually perform it before August 28th. So
we've got that. We've already had a special session called that began the day after the regular session ended. Short version of that, I think the House convened, said they passed the property tax bill, and they were done.
Yeah, and for quick reference with that, there was the property tax, there was in the budget for anybody, again, not insurance related, but the budget had an allocated amount for property taxes, but there was disagreement between the House and the Senate about how to go about that property tax cut. And so when Governor Abbott called a special session, on the call was just a specific way to cut property taxes, and that was the way that the House of Representatives wanted it. So they passed their bill and they adjourned, as Albert said, and left it up to the Senate. They said this is what the call is for the governor, and so the Senate has a different idea, and that's where we are.
Yeah, so that will continue. We suspect there will be other special sessions called, perhaps to deal with school vouchers or school funding, education funding. Um, and so border security has been mentioned as another potential special session issue. So there may be a busy summer for legislators. But all that said, like you mentioned, those are not insurance issues, thankfully. And we don't anticipate any special session issues on insurance. But let's talk about how the session wrapped up in general for insurance. And then we've got some events upcoming for ICT that'll get into a little more detail. But of the big 4 or 5 issues that got the most attention, I think if I recall correctly, we really just had one bill pass on an issue that was probably the most talked about up until the last month or so of session, and that was ESG and insurance. And various versions of that bill came during session. Ultimately, what passed sort of set some guidelines for ESG and how that is factored into ratings by insurance companies, and included some restrictions on TDI from adopting any ESG related rules from groups like NAIC or other national groups. But in the end, that did make it through. It was one of the last few insurance bills that made it through, I believe, on
I think it was
3 or
the
4
last
days.
bill that made it through the House, wasn't it? As
I
well.
think you're right. Yes, that was the one. You're exactly right. That was some
1158 or whatever on the last
I don't
day.
know. I don't know how you remember that time, but yes, I think you're exactly right. It was 11:58 because
I'm just guessing it was midnight.
Well, you're right. There's questions. I think they started the bill about 11:10 with a midnight deadline, and after some questioning by members and a point of order and consideration of that, literally about 11:58, it was voted out. I believe 86-54. I may have my numbers incorrect, but it did get voted out, so that passed. A lot of the other things we were following and paying attention to, again, up to the last minute, but those bills died. So issues like we spent a lot of time talking about appraisal for auto and home, and efforts to, by law, mandate timeframes for the appraisal process, mandate that courts would appoint an umpire if the appraisers couldn't agree. And then some of those bills, Angie, actually had requirements that I'll call it loser pays. If the umpire's award was $1 more than what was offered by the insured then had to pay the cost of appraisal. So a lot of back and forth on that. I think at the end, it ended up just being a bill, at least one version of it, simply required that auto and home policies have an appraisal clause contained in them. Now, most auto and home policies do already, but this would have mandated that if, for example, if you didn't have an appraisal clause for partial auto losses, this would seem to have required that you would have an appraisal clause for that. So it didn't pass. Would you guess that we're going to see this again?
Yes, I think so. I think given the fact that there was a lot of talk about it right before session, TDI, as you recall, or some of you may have recalled, they had it on as a recommendation or something to consider in their biennial recommendation report. And so I do think that the conversation will continue, and there seemed to be enough interest from various members of the legislature to look at it. So I don't know if we get an interim study or even if we don't, I do think that the conversation will continue.
Yeah, a lot of OPIC is very active in pushing for some change, and then a lot of activity by the Body Shop and other groups to Texas Watch to mandate something. So we'll see where that goes. Speaking of auto, the other big concern was mandated OEM parts for repair and the use of OEM processes to repair. That died in a House committee. after passing out of the Senate. But this is the second session, as I recall, we've seen the OEM parts issue. Probably the third or fourth session, we've seen some version of repair processes and restricting the use of quote, the least expensive parts to do repairs. So suspect we'll see that again. There was a lot of effort by industry lobbyists to counter some of the misinformation about warranties and the need for OEM parts. I know many of our members have endorsements that you can buy policies or get an endorsement to cover OEM parts, and so the marketplace is out there for that. But I think we'll see that issue pop up again as well.
Definitely.
Homeowners replacement cost. This is the second consecutive session we've had a bill that would have mandated 80% replacement cost payment after a loss. It almost did the exact same thing, if I'm correct, Angie, House Bill 287 this time.
I think it was the exact same bill. Yeah, that it was the bill that was substituted midway through. So it was the 80% bill.
Right.
Made it to the Senate.
Right, and then died without a hearing. Again in the Senate. So we may see that again. It keeps popping up, but it was an odd session. A lot of worry, I think, over some of those types of bills. TWIA funding. We started off talking about hurricane season, but some big push to try to change the funding structure for TWIA. In short version, a reminder was to get rid of public securities as a method of funding losses, so TWIA doesn't go into debt selling those. But a lot of back and forth. I think the House version had ultimately implemented or suggested a program where the state could loan, the comptroller's office could loan TWIA up to $1 billion, and then that would be repaid by a statewide surcharge on property policies. In the Senate, there was a different version at some point that dealt with LAE, loss adjustment expense, and removed that as part of TWIA's PML calculation. Required TWIA to use a 1 in 50 PML instead of a 1 in 100 under current law. Moved TWIA's headquarters, made it insurers, at least the first version as I recall, would have opened up insurers to an unlimited assessment to pay for losses above certain funding levels. So a lot of back and forth. I think there was probably 2 or 3 different versions of the Senate bill. Some hearings.
It's probably one for the bill that had the most versions at different points in time. I think it was changing quickly, even right before the floor when one of them passed. There was just a complete floor substitute to make it a study and to basically just do as you said, the PML portion. So I do think that we'll see, and that'll be interesting because I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, we no longer have a standing TWIA oversight committee to look at funding a study, right? That expired. And I think that they tried to revamp a study through the TWIA bill, one of the TWIA bills, and then that died. So it'll be interesting to see if the lieutenant governor maybe recommends it as an interim charge, or if that gets looked at in a formal way at all.
No, you're right. That funding study is gone. I think one version of the Senate bills, you talked about it changing, I think at the end had some language requiring a study in the interim of funding, or even looking at the funding mechanism with the state being able to invest. I used the word loan. I think the exact term that ends up in the bill was invest $1 billion into TWIA. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think one version of the House bill would have removed the requirement that insurers pay for any excess reinsurance. And by pay for, I mean are subject to assessment to pay for that. That didn't pass, obviously, so we still have that requirement out there. For this hurricane season, there is no excess reinsurance, so insurers will not be subject to that assessment. But just a lot of back and forth on TWIA. even within the industry. I think late in the session, there was some testimony from an industry member critical of the notion of the statewide surcharge. And so it's just, I think this is going to continue to be a question about funding going forward. And we'll see, what happens with TWIA funding as the interim moves forward until we get to the 2025 session.
Yeah, definitely funding. And I think maybe a focus on reinsurance, it seemed like, from what the Senate seemed interested in, on who pays that reinsurance and what level. And then we've already seen that play out even with when TWIA set their 1 in 100 PML this last time. So it'll definitely be something to watch.
Yeah. So a lot of the old Shakespeare, a lot of sound and fury during session. I cannot say it signified nothing. It signified quite a lot in this instance, but ultimately, I think for the P&C industry, session worked out well. Some of the things that were of great concern didn't pass, and obviously with the ESG bill passing, Senate Bill 833, companies will, review and make sure they're compliant if need be with that those new requirements. But overall, busy session. I think we tracked over 400, closer to 500 bills.
Yeah, closer to 500 this time. That was up from we tracked about 400 last session, and then we had over 500 this session. And there were just more bills filed this session as well. The House filed a record number of bills. They wrote 5,000 for the first time. So there was a lot out there.
So we just touched the surface of the big picture issues that either passed or didn't. I know there's a lot of other bills that did pass. Bills regarding cancellation or non-renewal of auto, liquidity stress testing for companies passed. There's things regarding roofing that didn't pass. There's a deductible bill that would have restricted the ability of companies in certain instances to waive a deductible. That didn't pass. So I think there's an ample opportunity for us to kind of cover that in more detail in some later online events, but pretty interesting. I don't want to use the word fun session because I know there's a lot of stress that went into getting through it, but a pretty interesting session to see how it worked out. It's good, as I said, to have P&C not be at the forefront, which I think is a testament to the market's doing fairly well here in Texas, and we're not having some of the issues that they're having in Florida or Louisiana or even California at this point. So I think overall, I think the industry can look at this session as a fairly
with the
positive
power play, it was a little bit like Succession probably at the end. So.
It may have been. Thankfully, there was no yelling and shouting that anybody saw in the hallways. But any other comments as we wrap up this podcast?
No, I think, like you said, we'll get into more detail and future webinars. And I think that there was, again, it was good that we didn't have, when you look at the numbers of bills that actually passed, this is an instance where small number is good because it means something's happening correctly. So we'll dive into some more later.
Okay. Yeah, we'll look forward to sharing with our members a little more detail in future events. And Rich will probably mention this as well, but during the symposium, we'll also have a brief recap of what passed and what it means for companies going forward. So thanks again, Angie, for all your work and effort and help during this session.
Thanks to you.
Excellent. What a good wrap up. As Albert mentioned, we'll have more of an in-depth wrap up, and we'll actually have Jay Thompson, who does a lot of work on the Hill for us and the industry. And so we'll be able to really dive into the legislative recap. That is on June 14th. So if you want to register for that, go check out our website, insurancecouncil.org/event calendar, and you can register for that, and that's open to members and non-members. There is a slight fee for non-ICT members, and we'll have another legislative recap with Jay and Albert at our symposium, which is going to be July 12th through the 14th up in Dallas. So we are excited about that. That's just over a month away. And so if there's any information that you want on that, it's at insurancecouncil.org. Angie, Albert, once again, great podcast, great discussion on the legislative session over the last several months. Probably as we get into July and August, we'll get into some more nerdy insurance stuff above and beyond the legislature as we look at our podcast schedule moving forward. Angie, Albert, thank you so much. This has been ICT on PNC. Everybody have a great one. This has been a production of the Insurance Council of Texas, Austin, Texas. All rights reserved. Copyright 2023.